Batman falls in love. Every single time. In nearly 90 years of comics, films, and television, there has always been a woman who reaches him, who sees past the mask before anyone else does, who offers him something close to an ordinary life. And every single time, he ends it before it becomes real. Not because he stops caring. Because the moment it starts to matter, something older than the cape and the cowl takes over, and he disappears. Writers have rebooted this story for decades. New actors, new cities, new tone entirely. The pattern survives every reboot untouched, across every studio, every era, every version of the character anyone has ever put on screen or on a page. A detail that, consistent across 90 years of storytelling, is not an accident of plotting. It is a psychological signature, hiding in plain sight inside the most famous origin story ever written. And the real question was never why Batman fights crime. Everyone already knows that answer. The real question is why the world's most capable, most resourceful, most relentless hero cannot seem to do the one thing an ordinary person manages without any training at all: stay. To understand why, it helps to slow down and go back to the alley, not the fictional alley itself, though it matters, but to what real psychology says happens inside a child's mind in the seconds after watching a parent die. Attachment researchers have spent decades studying what happens when a child's sense of safety collapses suddenly and violently, rather than eroding slowly over time. John Bowlby, the psychiatrist whose work founded modern attachment theory, argued that a child's earliest bond with a caregiver becomes a blueprint for every close relationship that follows, a template the brain reuses, largely without conscious awareness, in every romantic bond that arrives decades later, when that bond is severed through sudden loss. Particularly loss the child witnesses directly, the nervous system does something specific. It does not simply grieve. It reorganizes around the belief that safety was always an illusion, and that the people you love most can be taken from you in an instant, without warning, without reason, and without anything you could have done differently, no matter how much money, strength, or intelligence you might one day come to possess. This is the part that takes time to sit with, because it runs against how most people assume grief works. Grief, in this telling, is not simply sadness that fades. It is a complete rewriting of what the world is allowed to be trusted to do. Bruce Wayne was 8 years old. He watched two armed strangers take everything stable in his life in under a minute. On a street he had walked 100 times before. In a city he would spend the rest of his life try and protect and, in some sense, punish. This is precisely the kind of event attachment researchers describe as producing what they call disorganized attachment, a pattern where a child learns two contradictory truths at once. That closeness is the thing worth wanting most. And that closeness is also the thing that gets people killed. Most children who experience this kind of loss eventually find another caregiver who slowly rebuilds their sense of safety, a grandparent, a foster family, a community stepping in to fill the gap. Bruce Wayne, in nearly every version of the story, does not. He is raised by a loyal butler in an enormous, empty house, wealthy beyond comprehension and functionally alone, with no framework left for what safety is even supposed to feel like anymore, only the memory of the exact moment it disappeared. So he builds one, not out of feeling, out of control, and this is where the pattern starts moving faster, because Batman himself is not really a response to grief. He is a response to helplessness. Researchers studying trauma survivors have long noted that one of the most common coping strategies after a devastating loss of control is to seize control somewhere else, anywhere else, obsessively and completely, until the original helplessness gets buried underneath a version of life where nothing is ever left a chance again. Bruce Wayne trains his body until it can survive almost anything. He studies criminology, chemistry, and engineering until no scenario can catch him unprepared again. He builds an entire second identity around a single unbreakable rule. That vulnerability is what got his parents killed, and vulnerability is therefore the one thing he will never allow himself again. This is not a character quirk. This is a textbook avoidant attachment strategy, scaled up until an entire persona exists purely to make sure he never feels that specific helplessness twice. And the pattern keeps stacking, faster now. Avoidant attachment, in real psychological terms, is not the absence of love. It is the suppression of it, specifically for self-protection. Adults with this pattern equate emotional closeness with danger, not because they lack feeling, but because feeling deeply once cost them something they were never able to fully recover from. Hazan and Shaver's foundational 1987 research on adult romantic attachment found that people with avoidant patterns consistently reported discomfort with intimacy, difficulty depending on partners, and a strong preference for self-reliance, even when they privately longed for closeness, a contradiction later researchers confirmed again and again across different populations and decades of follow-up study. They do not avoid connection because it means nothing to them. They avoid it because connection has historically meant catastrophic loss, and the nervous system cannot tell the difference between a parent taken by violence decades ago and a partner getting slightly too close tonight. To the body, both register as the same category threat, filed under the same alarm, triggering the same ancient response. Now watch it happen, over and over, every time a woman gets close to Bruce Wayne. Selina Kyle sees him more clearly than almost anyone in his life ever has, matches his contradictions instead of fearing them, and still, decade after decade, he cannot fully let her in, circling back only when the danger is past, retreating again the instant it returns. Rachel Dawes tells him directly that she cannot be with the man behind the mask, that she needs a version of him without the armor, and he answers not by choosing her, but by disappearing further into the identity that keeps him safest, calling it timing instead of naming the fear underneath the timing. Andrea Beaumont very nearly becomes the exception, the one woman who reaches him before the mask exists at all, and the story takes his one chance at an uncomplicated love and destroys it through violence entirely outside his control, reinforcing the exact childhood lesson he was trying to outrun in the first place. That closeness gets punished by forces bigger than you, no matter how carefully you try to protect it. And here is the part that changes everything. Batman does not push women away because he does not want them. He pushes them away because wanting them fully without armor would mean reopening the exact vulnerability that got two people killed in front of him when he was 8 years old. Every act of intimacy in his life runs through the same unconscious calculation that the safest way to protect somebody he loves is to never let them close enough to become a target, and the safest way to protect himself is to never feel anything he cannot immediately control. Researchers who study survivors of childhood trauma call this exact pattern protective distancing, a strategy that looks like coldness from the outside but functions internally as an act of care so extreme it consumes the very relationship it exists to preserve, leaving both people convinced, wrongly, that indifference was the point all along. This is a twist almost every retelling misses entirely, the one hiding underneath every rooftop goodbye and every unexplained disappearance. The coldest thing Batman ever does is not a punch, a threat, or a vanishing act into the night. It is loving someone so completely that the only response his nervous system can generate is to leave before love gets a chance to be taken from him again, before the universe gets another opportunity to prove the 8-year-old right. Take a breath, because none of this makes Batman broken, and it does not make the pattern hopeless either. An avoidant nervous system built on top of real trauma does not simply relax because someone loves it well enough, no matter how patient or how devoted that person turns out to be. It requires the thing it fears most directly, staying past the point where leaving would have been easier, past the point where the mission would have justified another disappearance. In the rare versions of the story where Bruce Wayne actually gets to keep a connection, it is never because someone finally convinced him love was safe. It is because he chose deliberately and against every instinct built at 8 years old to stay anyway, fully aware that safety was never actually guaranteed for anyone, choosing closeness regardless of that fact rather than because the fear ever fully went away. That, more than the cowl, more than the cave, more than any villain he has ever fought, is the real story underneath Batman. Not a man who cannot love, a man taught in the worst possible way, at the worst possible age, that love is what gets taken from you, and spending the rest of his life deciding one disappearance at a time, whether that lesson still has to be true. Every reboot changes the city, the actor, the villain, the tone. None of them ever changed the alley, and none of them ever quite let him stay, because the character was never really built to answer whether he can love someone. He was built to keep asking, decade after decade, for as long as audiences keep needing to see themselves in a man who learned, far too young, that closeness and loss could arrive in the very same instant.